In this episode of Plants of the Gods, join ethnobotanist Dr. Mark Plotkin in conversation with world-renowned mycologist, botanist, author, and research scientist, Dr. Christopher Hobbs. In the second half of this two-part episode, Dr. Plotkin and Dr. Hobbs discuss the healing potential of fungi and medicinal herbs, with particular attention to the benefits and questions surrounding microdosing.
The two diseases I see our generation grappling with now and looking forward are depression and cancer.
Right.
And I know that you have dealt with both of those. What do you see the future, particularly from the fungal kingdom, in addressing those literally killer issues?
Well, with cancer again, I go with the species that have clinical trials. So there are all these mushrooms out there that will support your immune system, but how many actually have clinical trials showing that their survival rate is, the 5-year survival is higher, that you can, even in the face of chemo or radiation, you can keep your immune system stronger. It can help reduce the effects of chemo, such as fatigue, nausea, hair loss, and so forth. So we do have really good clinical trials. So for cancer, I've got to go with turkey tail because that one has the most clinical trials. Then you've got shiitake has quite a few clinical trials for its anti-cancer effect, for its immune supportive effect with chemo. And so and then reishi has a few clinical trials. So those are the three that I'm going to focus on every single time. You're not going to go for cordyceps. You're not going to go, and then lastly, of course, I've got to mention chaga. Chaga in Russia is a cultural treasure, as you know, and mainly it's for cancer. It's mainly used for cancer, and it's also for if you have gastritis. It's widely used as a tea for gastritis or gastric ulcer, but it's widely used for cancer. In fact, in my book, I tell this story. Do I have time to tell the story?
Yeah, I'm at it.
I was in the hot springs up in the mountains of California, and all these people from Ukraine and Russians love hot springs. So you're sitting in the hot springs pool, and people are speaking Russian and Ukrainian, and I always connect with somebody. And I was talking to this Ukrainian woman one time, and somehow mushrooms came up, and she said, I have two brothers, and I want to tell you this story. I had two brothers about the same age. They both got kidney cancer. It was ran in the family apparently. One of them was really not into chaga and not into healthy diet. So one of the brothers just went with chemotherapy and a more traditional, well, I hate to use the word traditional, but corporate
Western
medicine.
Traditional corporate.
Yeah, and the other one went for the chaga big time and changing their diet and everything. Turned out the brother that had, and they were very close, the brother that got the chaga and the healthy diet lived 5 years longer than the other brother that got the straight corporate medicine.
Mm-hmm.
So chaga has to be mentioned in there. That's a cultural treasure, and it's a very popular mushroom right now too. So those would be my top choices, definitely.
Now, what about depression, which is just getting worse every day, it seems?
Yeah, I just did a talk in Boulder with the Integrative Psychiatric Institute, IPI, and so some of the speakers there were saying that right now they think that around 30% of the population has pretty consistent and even clinically relevant depression and anxiety, especially, of course, around for isolation and the pandemic and so forth. So it's a huge problem, and especially with younger people. I'm really concerned about younger people now that are isolated. They can't go out and work. They can't go to school even. They can't date. I mean, this is serious. So, we acknowledge that this is a big problem in our society, and so what do you choose? I mean, there are some herbs that are used for depression and anxiety, which we could mention. That's another story. But as far as mushrooms go, I'm really into reishi, first of all, because a good reishi product has been known for centuries and maybe even 2,000 years as to calm the spirit. So it's been known as a spirit herb mushroom, calm the spirit. There are lots of triterpenes in there we know that have an effect on the central nervous system. So there is some science behind it. So for anxiety, I've had so much clinical experience with reishi. We used to make our own extracts when I lived in Santa Cruz. I had my clinic, and I saw such great results with reishi. You can really feel it. It's really experiential. So I love reishi as one of them. There are a couple small clinical trials with lion's mane for depression and anxiety. They're not astounding clinical trials, but at least it did show a positive effect. Mm-hmm. We know that there are lots of in vivo and in vitro studies showing that it does affect our nervous system, and so we do have that backing, but there are these two small clinical trials. So I'd recommend that. I'd recommend taking lion's mane regularly. Reishi definitely as a powder. The dose is typically 3 to 6 grams a day of the powder, so that's like a teaspoon twice a day, level teaspoon twice a day. So those are two of the really top mushrooms that I would recommend for depression and anxiety. However, then there's a third mushroom, which we all know what that is, and that's psilocybin. So, I started up my clinical...
I thought you forgot that one.
No, I'm not going to forget that one. So I've started my clinical practice up again. I took a break for a while, but now I've got my clinical practice going again. And I see a lot of people with anxiety. That's really a big one right now. So I am working with several people right now that have severe anxiety, and I got them on microdosing, and I'm seeing some real benefits for microdosing. And by microdosing, I mean 100 to 400 milligrams of the dried fruiting body, somewhere in that range. It could be higher, or lower. And it is really, so they're also taking benzodiazepines, of course, chronically, Xanax for a long time. Doesn't seem to be interfering with the Xanax. They want to get off it, but so far they've been microdoses are so safe, first of all. I microdosed for 9 months straight when I first started microdosing. This is like 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. But we used to pick our own along the coast, so I had access to plenty of them. And look at me now. I'm still rational anyway, mostly. So I'm really big on psilocybin, but of course that's a whole nother hour talk in itself.
But briefly compare and contrast microdosing versus macrodosing for depression and other psychiatric challenges.
So microdosing, there are not many clinical trials on microdosing, as you probably know. There are a couple of small ones now. But what we do have is a lot of in vivo and in vitro studies showing how psilocybin works in many ways in our brain, which is really interesting. Straightening out tangled networking of pyramid cells in our cortex, first of all, strengthening the connections between the neurological cells, the synapses. Mm-hmm. Not only repairing them, but strengthening them. And one of the biggest things is, when you really get into the functioning of the brain, it's so interesting, the immune system of the brain. So the microglia, for instance, is one of the main immune cells and they totally are binding to the neurological pyramid cells, all over the place, repair and strengthening them and improving the neural connections and the neuroconnectivity and the flow of the impulses. Also, clean up in the environment of the brain, the fluid, and vessels in the tiny vessels in the brain to make sure the neurological cells are getting enough glucose and they're getting enough oxygen. So these cells are crucial for, like you talk about getting to be 50, and dementia, of course, is one of the first things that can happen. That's one of the first signs of aging is you suddenly forget the nouns. My best friend.
What's his name? Yeah.
So that's microdosing. We have all that body of information that it's really good for support and repair and neural connections. On the other hand, one of the main this is such a deep subject here, is what Gabor Mate talks about, is that addiction, chronic anxiety, depression is predicated a lot on early childhood experiences, abuse, but not only just abuse, but even just not being able to bond to your caregiver, which happens so many times because, you think about our busy society, the parents can't sit down with their kids and really bond and attune. He calls it attunement. So lack of attunement, lack of bonding, even with the parents and the caregivers, this is a lifetime. This is according to Gabor Mate, and I really believe it. I mean, this has been a study of mine for a long time. So this is where the macrodoses of psilocybin come in, is to open up dissolve the ego, which is basically founded in these different areas of the brain called the default mode network. Fascinating research now, and dissolving the ego, dissolving this rigid artificial structure that we call ego that is important. We need our ego. Like Alan Watts used to say, that the ego isn't real, that you just want to get rid of it. No, we need our ego. This is protecting us. This is protecting us and making sense of all that input that's coming in. So we do need our ego, but unfortunately, a part of our ego can become very, very narrow. It can become very disordered, obviously, and it can suppress a lot of. We have all these coping mechanisms. The ego is the master of all of our coping mechanisms, suppressing these early things, and so they come up, and we don't even know it. We don't even know it. Something triggers us, and all of a sudden we're really depressed or we're really anxious. Why? So that's where the macrodoses come in, because that dissolves the ego, opens it up completely, so we can see that we're really part of all. We're part of everything, and that we don't have to have this narrow thinking, and I think that it's so powerful. It's really what I've seen personally. And ayahuasca falls into the same. These are all serotonin hallucinogenic. So ayahuasca falls into that category. LSD falls into that category as well. But I love, and peyote to a certain extent. But over all of them, I really love psilocybin the most for a variety of reasons.
Well, our colleague Paul Stamets has called psilocybin the Einstein molecule. But my question for you, are there other psilocybins out there in the fungal world, the angiosperm world, the coral reef, or is psilocybin the pinnacle which will never be equaled in terms of other natural products?
Well, there's nothing like these serotonin hallucinogens. They have a very specific action. We know how they work. It's profound. It really is. It goes deep, and helps heal. And the other thing that I find so interesting now is that the latest theory about how psilocybin works, entropy. And entropy basically, for the listener, if you don't know, exactly what entropy is a state, where the system is either incredibly compacted and narrow, or it's starting to loosen up. It's starting to get really, really loose. And that's what, as we age, our the entropy of our brain and our network becomes so tight and so condensed. And you see these older people that, it's just like, this is how it is, and this is all it is.
Yep.
Whereas psilocybin just opens all that. So it really increases the entropy. And that's so. Can we find another molecule that's like that? Well, of course, there's, besides ayahuasca, of course, there's ibogaine. There's San Pedro, of course, and there are other ones too. I mean, there are other ones. But what I find interesting is that in researching the history of hallucinogens, mushrooms pop up in art, cave art, and stones, mushroom stones, and all. And it goes back probably 3,000 to 5,000 years. So psilocybin has been around. Certainly, we have more recorded data from history for psilocybin. Maybe that's one reason why it's so fantastic. But
so one last question about psilocybin. My mentor Schultes went down to Oaxaca to find the Mazatecs and two other tribes using psilocybin. But our friend Juliana Furci says that there's over 10 species of hallucinogenic mushrooms in Massachusetts, where Schultes spent his whole life when he wasn't in the Amazon. Why did one of our colleagues have to go to the far reaches of southern Mexico to find magical mushrooms when they were growing literally in his backyard?
I don't know if it's that many species. I don't believe that, but but certainly 5 or so, yeah. Well, because there's no tradition, there's no history. No one knew anything about them. And so the word, Gordon Wasson obviously had his ears opened up and his eyes opened up with it from his wife Valentina, and together they started exploring and writing and researching, and he just got an inkling that something is going on down there in southern Mexico, and went down and finally asked around and hooked up with Maria Sabina, and she was the one. She was the knowledge holder. She was the wisdom holder. And we need, you can't just have the mushrooms. You have to have the wisdom holder for those mushrooms, and the songs and the ritual. All of that is necessary. So that's why they had to go all the way down there to get, to get the wisdom, the song, and the mushroom. And Hoffman helped us, figure out what the active ingredients were and everything. But that's the story right there. And I think for any, as you know, any shamanistic practice, we need the stories, we need the lineage, we need the tradition, and we need people like when I went down for ayahuasca. He told our ayahuasquero was a 5th generation ayahuasquero, and he was saying, well, it's very strict, and you have to train for 5 years, and you have to fast, and you have to pray, and you have to learn the songs and the rituals, and you can't have sex, and you have to have a very narrow diet. And this is not, you see people calling themselves shamans. You got to go through, because they've got a certificate.
No, they went to Esalen for a weekend.
Right, weekend workship.
Yes, we call them rent-a-shamans.
Yeah, right. No, this is deep. This is the hero's journey. I really like talking about that, but this is the hero's journey, and so this is the real thing, and so that's why obviously they had to go down there.
So as we wind down, explain to me how a psychedelic voyage is a hero's journey.
Well, because the hero's journey is like. Joseph Campbell was the one who really went in a lot of different cultures and gathered all these stories and then said, but they all have really similar stories. They all have similar elements to them, which is basically you hear the call. You hear, you're suffering. You have suffering. You hear, well, there must be something better. There must be something different. So you hear the call, and then you don't answer the call. You don't answer the
it's
call.
It's the call to adventure.
Yeah. You don't answer the call because it sounds scary and it sounds weird, and so then you have to go through all this stuff before you finally answer the call and you go. But when you do, you get a guide. You get a magical substance. And so it fits perfectly into psilocybin because you've got the facilitator, you've got psilocybin, and it really, when you read Joseph Campbell and all those steps, it sounds just like taking a psychedelic journey.
So here's my theory. One of the reasons we have so much mental illness is people don't complete their own hero's journey. Everybody's on a hero's journey in their life. And because of the way our culture is, people don't get to complete that. They don't meet the mentor. They don't deal with the threshold guardians. Right. And when you take a psychedelic substance, when you take the mushrooms in Oaxaca or Berkeley or ayahuasca and Iquitos, you're on that journey. You're meeting the mentor. You're meeting the threshold guardians. And that's allowing you to complete this journey, which you didn't make in your life in many cases. And that's why it can be such a healing experience.
Well, I agree with you 100%. And it's really that's being human. I think that's why we're here. We're here. We have all these problems. We have struggles. We have suffering. That's being a human being, is answering that call. And having a spiritual, I had my spiritual awakening in like 32 or something like that, where everything just blew open and nothing was ever the same since. And I realized, looking back, how clueless I was before that. Mm-hmm. And it was partly all the psilocybin that I was taking, partly because I got in the Polarity Institute and started meditating a lot and doing all these practices. But for every person, I think I wish for every person that's listening for your hero's journey or your heroine's journey. I agree with you 100%. I think that is absolutely necessary.
So last question before we wind up, Dr. Christopher Hobbs. I'm always asking shamans why shamanic medicine works. And one shaman told me, when you're 7 years old and you fall down and hurt your knee gets better and it stops hurting. When you're 57 years old and fall down and hurt your knee gets better, but it doesn't stop holding because your body is holding onto that knee because of all the stress, and you're punishing yourself for subjecting yourself to so much stress.
Right.
And under the influence of shamanic tutelage, under the influence of psilocybin or ayahuasca or salvia divinorum, the shaman can help you let go of that stress and let go of that pain and move on with your life.
Cultural stress, personal stress, narrow thinking, too much entropy, all of those things just are killing us. I mean, we're a sick society. I don't know how you could argue against that. This is a very sick society that we're living in. And to me, here's the bottom line, right? For me, is that we have all these problems. We have health problems. We have, there's so many problems in our country. We have great wealth, but it's not shared fairly or equitably at all. And there are so many people suffering. So we have all these problems. We're living in a sick society. But we can't count on the politicians for fixing this. We can clearly see that. I mean, that's a no-brainer. So what we really need is a grassroots, widespread shift in consciousness, and that's where psilocybin comes in. And that's why I think we're seeing, because I think if you look at the history, we've seen other periods before where, and of course you know the stories about Christianity, or Jesus might have been a psychonaut and all these, I don't want to get too far into that, but and what is soma, of the Vedic elixir that people say, I'm kissing the sky, I must have been drinking soma. Well, that had to be psilocybin. It's not Amanita muscaria, because that's not a psychedelic mushroom. That's an inebriate. That's an inebriating mushroom. So I think psilocybin is so many people are now interested in growing, making medicine, taking it, microdosing. I mean, I'm seeing an incredible, I'm sure you have, an incredible interest in it, because these politicians are going to do nothing for us. We've got to really transform our consciousness.
Well, at ESPD 55, there was an Iranian fellow who gave a brilliant presentation on the origin of Zoroastrianism as being tied to ergot.
Wow.
And then there was another Muslim fellow there who said, well, the Prophet Muhammad, blessed be his name, ascended to heaven on a white steed. There was a fungal or botanical explanation tied into that. Nobody knows.
Nobody knows.
But you see this in all these religions.
All religions.
And I think it's time to re-examine all of those. So living in an era of depression and pollution and greed and racism and division, is the psychedelic renaissance one of the best hopes we have?
It is, without question. I mean, I'm biased, but even just looking at the facts, being rational, we know that the politicians aren't going to help us. Government isn't helping us. It's making it worse in many cases. So what can we do? We have to open up our mind to other possibilities, and that's what psilocybin does. And also, lastly, we have to start thinking more about others and the group, and also what is going to benefit the wider, arena of all citizens, not just ourselves. We have to get out of this me type of thinking, and psychedelics do that.
Man, I'd like to make this a 24-part series, but you're too busy a person for that. So let's call it a day.
All right.
I'm eternally grateful. This was wonderful. I can't wait to listen to it again myself.
Thank you.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, please remember to give us a good rating and to subscribe and share with like-minded folks. We appreciate your support for the protection of the knowledge and biodiversity of South America by the Amazon Conservation Team.